From spring break. Now we're going to sort of shift gears and start talking about something a little bit different because up to this point, we've really focused on the first part of this distinction, the intra-group processes, the things that are going on within particular social groups. So things like group polarization, groupthink, how diverse groups can lead to good decisions, social facilitation, stuff like that. Now we're going to shift over to talking about how groups interact with one another. So intergroup processes, remember, the behavioral and psychological functions, or sorry, dynamics between different social groups or between individuals from different groups. So this could be between groups like people of different nationalities, of different races, of different genders, of different social strata, of different religions, anything like that. And both of the following qualify as that. Two literal groups coming into an interaction with one another, or people who are marked by some sort of group identifier that are aware that they're in an intergroup situation. So a group of Christians and a group of Muslims meeting together, there are intergroup processes between the two of them. But a white person and a black person, for example, coming together and being aware of the differences in group memberships that they have, also from our perspective, should qualify as an intergroup interaction. Whether or not that is a good thing or a constructive thing is another question, but the things that we bring to the table in terms of our identities are still at play, even when we're not in a literal group setting. So with that in mind, I want to set the stage a little bit more for talking about intergroup relations by talking about intergroup conflict. Now, obviously, groups can work together very frequently, and oftentimes this is by coming together and realizing that maybe you have things in common. But you might say that groups come into conflict more often when they are distinct in some ways or when they are at odds, right? So obviously intergroup conflict, not intra-group conflict, but intergroup conflict is conflict between groups. And this has been an enduring topic of interest for social psychologists and lots of other types of social scientists. Why do groups come into conflict so easily? Why do they fight? Why do they struggle? What leads to this? A lot of different ideas about this have had to do with things like individual differences and personality. So are there things about members of particular groups that maybe make them hostile or aggressive, or certain types of groups that are more submissive than others or less capable? So, what features of the people within different groups are going to lead to different types of inequities and conflicts and things like that. We'll talk a little bit about these types of theories when we get to prejudice a bit, but for the most part, social psychologists tend to look more at obviously the situational and structural factors that exist between groups and the processes that influence those. So two of the main perspectives that we're going to talk about in this unit, and again we'll get to more in the prejudice unit, are things that have to do with the relative relationships between groups or the level of competition between them. So first we will talk about realistic group conflict theory, then we'll move to talking about social identity theory. And these theories, have been in, I don't know, we might even say like a conversation with each other for decades, trying to figure out which one of them explains more, and I think most people would say that there is a clear winner in that regard, but remember, no theory necessarily explains everything, and a lot of times they, complement one another. Okay. So let's start by talking about realistic group conflict theory. This is an idea that lots of different people are credited with. Um, One person that I'll credit here, just because we're going to talk about one of his studies, is somebody that we have talked about already in our class, Muzafer Sherif. He was somebody who um, did work on conformity that we've talked about already. Remember that study, the autokinetic effect, where they were trying to see if people's estimates of how that stationary light in a dark room would change based on hearing what other people's estimates were. So people, trying to seek information from other people when they maybe didn't have the information themselves, and how that leads to conformity through informational social influence. Sherif is more famous for a study that he did that has to do with the conflict between groups. But it contributed to a bigger corpus of knowledge called realistic group conflict theory. The core tenet of realistic group conflict theory is that groups are in competition over something, over some kind of resource. It's not just that, some groups are more aggressive or something, or groups are mean. It's that groups come into conflict with one another because they both want something, whether it be like water or land or money or food or whatever it happens to be. If there is a limit on those things and two groups want them and there's not enough for both of them, then they are going to have problems. So some of the predictions that have to do with this: if there is direct competition, meaning both groups are going after the same thing and there's not enough, then that's going to lead to tension between those groups and hostility, maybe even things like fighting or war or things like that. When there are more things that groups are competing over, so if their goals are numerous, that there's a limit on water and a limit on good areas for shelter and a limit on food and a limit on oil or whatever it happens to be, the more of these things that are scarce and there's competition over, the more hostility and tension there will be. And if these things are more important. If the groups are fighting over like cotton balls or something, or I don't know, it's hard to think of things that don't matter at all, I guess, but if things are less important, then the conflict is going to be less, or maybe it won't exist at all. But if it is something like food or water that you need to survive, then there's going to be more tension and hostility. Another important tenet of this is not just explaining why groups come into conflict, but realizing that the inverse of these things, or fixing them, can lead to less tension and hostility, or less conflict. So if groups are more interdependent, or if they are more likely to work together to achieve their goals and get what they need, then there will be less tension and hostility. One really important thing to note about this is how to study something like this, you need a pretty complex and nuanced research program, right? The things that we're able to study in a laboratory or study with surveys or something like that are, kind of removed from reality in a sense. If you bring people into a laboratory, the type of conflict and hostility that you're going to see from them is generally not going to be very comparable to, big cultural conflicts, or of course things like genocide or war, right? We can't really study those things, or we can't study those things directly in the lab. And when you ask people questions on surveys, then you don't really have direct access to them necessarily. You don't have high enough levels of control to really make the types of inferences you might want. There are a lot of things to keep in mind when you're studying conflict and how close you are to that real conflict. And conflicts that matter are complicated. So most conflicts have some sort of rich history behind them. It's not that the conflicts between the Israelis and the Palestinians are very easily explained or understood or agreed upon. It's not as though before the Rwandan genocide, things between the Tutsis and Hutus were completely fine and no one had a problem, and there wasn't, a long period of, imperial occupation that led to them being in the positions they were in. Things are complicated. So trying to apply anything to every cultural or historical context, like a simple prediction like this, is difficult, and that's why some of these predictions that we're looking at seem really straightforward, right? But it's really these researchers trying to boil conflict down to its most simple parts, to its essence. So we can try to study conflict in a systematic way, but we need to be mindful that it is not necessarily going to be exactly right or the easiest thing to do. Excuse me. Sharif is probably most famous in this area of research because of a study that he did in the late 1940s and 1950s called the Robbers Cave Study. And it's called the Robbers Cave Study because he conducted it at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma, where he was working at the time. I mean, not at the park, but at a university in Oklahoma. And he, instead of using, people from a particular like ethnic or religious group, he wanted to just look at, more innocent people and try to instill conflict in them and see if he could fix it, basically. So in the Robbers Cave Study, he recruited 5th grade boys to participate in a summer camp that lasted a couple weeks. In the study that's most widely reported, I mean, he did this a few times, but there were 22 boys that they split up into 2 groups, basically. And they kind of matched these boys as being similar in socioeconomic backgrounds. They kind of wanted to make sure that they, didn't have these different resource sorts of inequities between them. And I mentioned they separated them into 2 groups. They didn't tell the 2 groups of boys that there were more than one group, or there was more than one group in the camp. So they brought these boys to the camp. They're in 2 groups of 11 kids, and they just think they're in a group of 11 kids at this like summer camp retreat. So they did a bunch of staged things to try to demonstrate some things about conflict with them. And while they were doing this, they had the counselors that were in on it. They had people observing them. And Sharif, even while they were conducting this study, he was around. He posed as a custodian the whole time to be close, but wasn't necessarily believable that an older guy was a camp counselor, so he decided that it was reasonable for him to be a custodian, I guess. But he was there participating and watching things. So when they brought kids to camp, they wanted to first, instill a sense of group identity in them to make them feel like they were, kind of on a team and identify with one another. So they did this by first just having them do all the normal types of things that you would do at camp, bonding through games and different physical activities, and singing songs about the campfire and stuff like that. And it's not hard when you're in close quarters with people, seeing them all the time, having fun, to form a tight bond. So this wasn't the most difficult thing to do. And they encourage them to kind of come up with a team identity or group identity by coming up with names and doing things like decorating their bunkhouses and things like that. And the 2 groups of boys came up with the names for themselves: the Eagles for one group and the Rattlers for another group. So by this point, they even have generated labels for themselves to really solidify that group identity. So once they really had them feeling like a team, feeling like a coherent group, then the researchers kind of instilled some conditions for conflict. And remember, realistic group conflict theory is going to be all about competition over resources. So after they'd spent a week kind of secretly keeping the boys on opposite sides of this big state park, they revealed the existence of the other teams to them. In this kind of famous photograph from the study, this is the first time the Eagles and the Rattlers set eyes on one another. And lo and behold, it's not that difficult to get two different groups of people to want to compete with one another, maybe kind of presaging some of the things that we'll talk about with social identity theory in the next lecture. But it was immediate that the boys wanted to compete with the other group, even before they necessarily knew that there was going to be any competition over scarce resources. Both teams were asking their counselors desperately to, show that they were better than these other boys. So maybe this is our kind of first indication that realistic group conflict theory maybe doesn't explain everything. So during this sort of intergroup competition phase, they still, went ahead with the things they wanted to do to try to make resources scarce. They had them, compete over prizes. That's a scarce resource when you're competing against another group, and only one group gets a prize, right? Zero-sum game, just like, some resource conflicts are in the real world. They raced each other, tug of war, treasure hunt type things like that, capture the flag, where one team would get a prize or get something of the other groups. They also made banners for their groups to kind of, again, solidify that group identity. And you can see that when the groups are making these banners, they're really focused on the other group, right? So the Eagles even are, referencing the other group in their motto that you may win, but we'll give you a hell of a fight. That they're talking about the competition even when they are trying to show their spirit for their group. As a side note, I think Tom Hale was the name of the bunkhouse that they were in. It's not just some random name on there, but that's not that important, I guess. But unsurprisingly, they start doing this, all this competition over scarce things, and hostility and tension ensue. They're insulting each other, they're getting into fist fights, they're stealing things from each other, they're vandalizing and raiding each other's cabins, and the researchers or counselors on several occasions had to physically separate the boys so they didn't injure one another. So obviously resource scarcity seems to have something to do with conflict, but then how do you fix it? That's the kind of the corollary there. That's maybe more important, that if you remove scarcity and you increase interdependence, how can you get groups to cooperate? So that was the third phase, kind of the third week of camp. To do this, the researchers made conditions such that the boys had to work together for things. So they introduced what we will call in social psychology and sociology superordinate goals. Superordinate meaning common or shared goals that include both of these groups, not just one of them, not subordinate to one group, superordinate to both groups. So they did things that the boys could not do on their own, basically. So they had all these kind of intricately staged things where they told the boys that this truck was stalled and it had all the food for the camp, and 11 boys would not be enough to push it, but if they all worked together, they could push it all the way to the mess hall, I think is what I'm trying to look for. I was going to say galley, but I think that's on a boat. But anyway, they could push this truck all the way to where they needed to get it, and then they could eat. But without working together, they would not be able to get their food. Another one where they had a tree that they kind of cut halfway down and told the boys that it was dangerous from like a storm, and it could fall and hurt somebody, and they needed to work together to get it down and make sure everybody was safe. And then, putting up these complicated tents that they didn't have all the right equipment to do it. They had to work together to think of ways to put the tents up. And I think one I don't have up here, they had some kind of water pump that they couldn't turn all by themselves, so they had to work together to get water from this like pump that the counselors pretended that was broken or rigged to seem like it was broken. Excuse me. So when they did all these things, they had the boys work together. They reduced the hostile intergroup conflict. And what they found was that many of the boys even developed these strong friendships with kids from the other group, whereas in the second week they hated each other. But by the end of the third week, they found that some of the strongest friendships, or the boys reported being best friends with some of the kids from the other group. Like an eagle would pick a rattler as their best friend. And they also indicated some things, even outside of the bounds of what the researchers were trying to get them to do, where they had some money that they had to, buy things at the, commissary or whatever of the camp, and they came up with the idea of pooling their money to, rent a projector in a movie and watch a movie. So they were, very actively engaging in positive intergroup relations and intergroup cooperation. So a couple of things to note about the Robbers Cave studies, and I say studies even though I have study up here, just for full transparency. It wasn't, there's one version of the study that gets reported the most often. This is one that was conducted in 1954, but they did try this 2 other times. They did it in 1949, where they started with one group and then separated pairs of best friends, so trying to, maybe do a little more of a stringent test, and they found something pretty similar. And they tried to do it in 1953 also, but the conflict between the groups, according to the researchers, was so intense that they had to stop, that they were fighting so much that they didn't feel like they could keep the boys safe. I struggle to think exactly what the threshold of that was for 10 and 11-year-old boys, but I'm sure they didn't want to send kids home with like black eyes or anything like that. So they terminated the study before they even got to the 3rd week, where they introduced cooperative goals. But maybe they would have worked, who knows. But if nothing else, I think this shows in 3 out of 3 of these studies, competition seems to have something to do with conflict between the groups, and in the 2 where they were able to introduce the superordinate goals, that seemed to ameliorate or improve the conflict and lead to more positive interactions between the groups. So from these different things, Sharif and his colleagues concluded conflict over resources, leads to more tension and hostility. And importantly, and something we'll circle back to in the 7th part of the group processes lectures, that they uncovered something really important about the nature of intergroup contact. That just having groups come together can be bad, right? That if they're in competition, or if other conditions are met, like we'll talk about in the next lecture, you might make things worse, or things might stay bad if groups are just coming together. But if you can lead them to cooperate, to do something, then that seems to help. That if they are working toward a common goal, 2 groups can, drastically improve their opinions of one another. Some commonly recognized issues with realistic group conflict theory, though, are, kind of indicated by some of the things I already mentioned about the Robbers Cave study. That, you don't necessarily need scarcity for conflict. The boys, as soon as they saw each other, they wanted to compete. They wanted to beat the other group. they had tension and hostility before there were even any zero-sum sorts of outcomes or scarce resources or anything. So although it may be possible, or it seems possible or likely, that conflict increases hostility and tensions, conflict can happen without that. So realistic group conflict theory doesn't really explain how or why that happens. So it does seem like it does lead to conflict, but it's not a necessary condition. Conflict can arise without scarcity. Okay. So sorry, I already went through this next slide, but to kind of demonstrate the next set of predictions and ways that we want to think about conflict, I want to do a quick exercise. And so finish this lecture and finish the things that I'm about to do. Then you will need to go to back to Canvas and complete the April 15th activity that I have up there. It's a few questions that I'm going to set up here. Then go on to lecture 6 for group processes, and then that will explain why we're doing the things we're about to do. So I'm going to show you an array of dots really quick. I want you to don't stop this and count them, just take as long as I show them, get a sense of how many dots there are, and I just want you to make an estimate of how many dots I show you. Okay, ready? Take a look, try to make a guess, and write your guess down, or just remember it for the next few seconds. But you should have a number in your head or a number written down at this point. So part of what I want to do here is talk about a particular group difference that's going to be important going forward. That there seems to be kind of a different way that people go about estimating these things, or, well, let's call it an individual difference in our perception of groups of things. That people tend to very reliably either overestimate things or underestimate things. And of course, like, any individual difference, there is kind of a middle area, but most people fall on one end or the other and do this pretty consistently. So there were 180 dots in that display. From that 180 number there, you should be able to decide, are you an overestimator? Did you guess more than 180? Or are you an underestimator? Did you guess less than 180? So should be relatively easy for you to indicate that. And that is the first question on your activity for April 15th. And then it's going to ask you some follow-up questions just to talk about what you think the typical members of overestimators and underestimators are like. So you're making generalizations about these groups, remember, and I will talk about why you're doing this in Group Processes Lecture 6.